Hello, guten Tag, and welcome to another YouTube video. In today's video I want to tackle the discussion that is, well, as old as the Canon 5D Mark II. Is autofocus only for amateurs, or can it be used in a professional film setting? I see people arguing about this online and in real life all the time. There's the hardcore fraction of cinematographers that think that autofocus is only for TikTokers and, well, content creators. And there's the other faction, people that actually make a living shooting video and have never used a manual lens in their life. And then there's me, I guess, a cinematographer that sits somewhere in the middle. I started out using only cameras with autofocus and then switched to using mostly cine cameras and cine lenses and not using autofocus at all. And now I use a little bit of both. For some jobs I use autofocus cameras, and for others I just have a focus puller that pulls focus for me. So in this video I will give you my take on when to use which, could you actually use autofocus on bigger sets, and I will tell you the story of how autofocus actually saved my ass for a shot that made it into a Oscar-winning documentary. So first things first, a little bit more about me and my journey, so you know a little bit more about where I'm coming from. Well, almost literally. When I started filmmaking, I started with the Sony a7 II, and I progressed to other Sony cameras like the a7S II, and then eventually I switched to Canon with the Canon 1DX Mark III, 5D Mark IV, and the Canon C200 has been my workhorse for the longest time. Coming from stills photography, I was used to shooting everything in autofocus, and that's what I did for the beginning of my filmmaking career as well. Shooting with the Canon 1DX Mark II and the C200, I paired them with autofocus lenses, and I never focused manually for probably the first 2 years of my career. And during the time I was booked for many different things. Small commercials, interviews, documentaries, testimonials, you name it. And all of this was possible with just me as a solo shooter and one assistant. And that was thanks to autofocus. And I remember that I was looking at other brands like Red or Blackmagic, but the thought of not being able to use autofocus kind of scared me, because I was shooting a lot on a gimbal and autofocus was just so convenient. And the autofocus on Canon cameras was just really good. But then there were also a lot of jobs and scenarios where autofocus just wasn't the right tool for the job. Whenever I was using autofocus on set and the autofocus messed up, I could just do another take and another take and another take until the autofocus did what I wanted it to do. But when shooting real life documentaries, run and gunning, and the autofocus misses its mark, well, you can't really repeat that take and it looks really unprofessional. After a while I also noticed that being an autofocus only guy really limits my potential, because I can only shoot on lenses and cameras that have a really good reliable autofocus. I was never able to shoot anything anamorphic because there's no anamorphic lenses with autofocus. When I'm being hired as a cinematographer for somebody else and they provide a camera or lens combo, I would have had to decline because I just can't pull focus manually unless they give me a focus puller. So here I really wanted to learn how to focus manually, not only barrel focusing while I'm the camera operator, but also pulling focus wirelessly on a dedicated monitor. So making this step just opened so many more possibilities for me. Being able to pull focus manually not only gave me more control over my scenery, but it also gave me more peace of mind, because I didn't have to rely on my camera's capabilities, but on my own. So what does it mean? When shooting reality TV or documentaries, you should never use autofocus, because once it messes up, you can't repeat the scene? Well, not really. I have a confession to make. I watch a lot of trash TV on Netflix while rigging my camera, setting up, or just to wind down. And there's a lot of reality TV on there that is being shot with autofocus. And sometimes it does mess up and you can see the focus hunting, and for me as a filmmaker this looks absolutely unprofessional, but nobody else will actually notice. And I think most of these reality TVs are being shot on the Sony FX9 as well as the FX6, and well, they do have a really good reliable autofocus. Again, once in a while it does mess up, but it just makes your life so much easier. And it mostly just cuts your crew in half, because if you're on a shoulder rig and you can just use autofocus instead of having a dedicated focus puller, that just cuts a lot of costs in the long run. Okay, Damien, what you're saying is that if you have the budget, then you should always have a focus puller and pull manually, right? Also not really, because there are scenarios that are not limited by the money you have or the budget, but they are limited by the scenarios. And that is true for a lot of run and gun documentaries. So here's my anecdote. A lot of you know that I have been a cinematographer for the feature film documentary Navalny. And on some of the shots, I actually used a Canon R5 completely with autofocus. One night, Daniel Roher, the director of the film, called me up and said he needs me the next morning because there's beautiful snow outside in Vienna and he needs me to film a 1 hour long scene. And that was basically a one take. And he wanted me with a gimbal, walking behind that person and just filming his every move. There wasn't time to switch setups. He also didn't want to have a lot of attention drawn to us. So it was a really limited crew. It was just the subject, the director, and myself. I put the camera on a one-handed gimbal with a 28-70 and then I just followed the subject for about an hour. We walked around for like 3 or 4 or 5 miles. Having a dedicated focus puller that just walks behind you and pulls focus on a monitor in the snow outside at really cold weather just wasn't feasible. And we really wanted to get these shots and we only had this morning because of the weather conditions. Could we have done it with a focus puller? I guess so, but we didn't need to because again, the R5 just didn't mess up and the autofocus was on point for 1 hour of continuous shooting. Another scenario that I find myself loving the autofocus and I don't think I could do it manually is when shooting underwater. I have the R5C in an underwater housing for some of my commercial jobs and I just rely on autofocus, which works flawlessly even underwater most of the times. And due to the housing, I can't really pull focus manually, and due to the camera being underwater, you can't transmit a signal out to a focus puller anyway. So it's either going to be manual focus on a wide angle lens with a closed down aperture, or you could just use the autofocus. And with this, you have so much more capabilities because you can zoom in and you can just also open up your aperture, which just wouldn't be possible if you just put the camera to manual and you can't focus the lens. Another fact about me that most of you know is that I shoot a lot of multicam interviews. I just wrapped up my interview masterclass that I'm going to release early next month. And while filming this, I used 2 Canon C70s and an R5C for my 2 people interview setups. And every time I did that, I noticed that the autofocus, especially on the Canon cameras, is just spot on. And the other day I was a cinematographer as well as the gaffer for a big Canadian documentary that was filmed here in Vienna, and we shot on 3 red cameras, the Helium, a Gemini and a Komodo. And we didn't use autofocus because, well, the Gemini and the Helium don't have autofocus and I definitely wouldn't rely on the autofocus of the Komodo. So not only did we have 3 really expensive cameras, but we also had to have 3 single operators that had to pull focus manually on each camera. So yes, there are projects that require red cameras and manual cine lenses, but those projects also need to have a bit higher budget and more people involved. But there's also projects where a Sony or Canon camera is the better tool for the job. You could film a 3-angle interview, set all of your cameras to autofocus, and then limit the people on set and therefore the budget requirements. So let's summarize and give you my take on if autofocus could be used professionally. In short, yes, it absolutely can. The longer answer is a bit more complicated. I think there's different tools for different jobs. Sometimes there's just no need to have a dedicated focus puller on every camera when you're just shooting an interview and you do have a camera that has a reliable autofocus. But then there's projects where autofocus just doesn't get you anywhere. When you have a complex scene with actors and blocking and you really need to rack focus from one spot to the other and you can't tell autofocus what to do, then you do need a dedicated focus puller. So what is my future gonna look like? Will I still be using autofocus or will I be shooting everything manually with a dedicated focus puller? Well, I will be doing both. I'm shooting on autofocus right now. I still have my 2 Canon C70s and the Canon R5C, and for some jobs, they're just the better tool than my red camera, for example. If you don't have the time to set up the manual focus system as well as a wireless monitor, and you don't have any complex scenes, then autofocus will do the job just fine. I can throw in the Canon C70 on a gimbal and just perform a lot of simple movements with it. There's also a lot of scenarios where I think that autofocus is superior to a dedicated focus puller. When you shoot on a full frame camera with a wide open lens, it's really hard to keep that in focus mechanically. But sometimes the autofocus just does an amazing job and the technology has come so far that I think that the autofocus is doing a better job than a focus puller could ever do. And for these scenarios, I don't want to limit myself. I don't want to step down the lens so that the focus puller has an easier job when the camera can actually do that just fine. So for me personally, whenever I have the time and the budget, I will always hire a dedicated focus puller. But I'm also realistic. There are some scenarios where pulling focus manually just slows you down and maybe just isn't feasible. And for these jobs, I will still use my autofocus cameras, because technology is amazing and it has come such a long way. Why not make use of it? So now let me know down in the comments below. Are you an autofocus person, or do you only pull focus manually? I hope you liked this video, and if you did, then please give it a thumbs up, because it really helps the channel grow. I would really appreciate it if you hit the subscribe button. It's free. And while you're already here, check out one of my other videos and also make sure to check out Filmora. Link is in the description.